AI Realized, the podcast about everything that is new now and next for enterprise executives deploying AI. Our guests will share what's driving AI adoption, use cases, and business models for the data and AI economy.
Why the future is bright.
Welcome to AI Realized, the podcast for enterprise executives leading AI adoption. From tackling security, data, and operational challenges to navigating organizational transformation, AI deployment offers a unique opportunity to redesign our organizations from the inside out. I'm Christina Elwood, your host for today's episode. The persistent challenge in enterprise AI adoption has been organizational and management rather than technology. We've heard that from our community since the very first summit, and our guest today puts a sharp point on it. When executives ask why AI investments are not paying off, he doesn't point to the technology. He points to the fact that this powerful new engine has been bolted onto an operating logic that was never built to run at this speed. That really makes it a leadership question rather than a technical one. Who decides what agents are allowed to do? What is it allowed to see? Where authority sits when there is no human in the loop on every decision? That's his argument in The River Doesn't Wait, a senior executive guide to navigating the surge of agentic AI. And that author, Blaine Mathieu, is here today with us, and he's the founder of the River Group. Blaine, welcome, and thank you for joining me this morning.
Thank you, Christina. I've been looking forward to this conversation.
I am too, because it's really been such a joy to work with you on this workshop that we have coming up on September the 15th. But we'll get to that in just a minute, because I think this is really the key element that has, for many people, been missing. But before we get into it, I do want listeners to have a sense of your vantage point, because it does go back further than most. You were a Gartner analyst and published the first global e-commerce forecasts. You've been a CMO, a CPO, and a CEO several times. And most recently, when you were at Partexo, and your clients included companies like Ford and SoftBank and ABB. And you first published work on AI way back in 1990 in Ray Kurzweil's book. So a couple of decades before the rest of us were paying attention, you were actually working in this particular area. But today, your work is with enterprise leadership teams on decisions related to agentic AI and the decisions that agentic AI is really forcing. There's no product for you to sell today, and you're not really here to discuss anything about technology solutions or things like that. You're really here to talk about those obstacles, how to overcome them, and why they're there in the first place, so we can get to the root cause and really address them.
100%. Touch on a few points you raised. I've been working in the area of corporate strategy, and mostly from the startup perspective, engaging with large enterprise clients, although I also was running market intelligence for Adobe for a few years. And as you said, a Gartner analyst working with a lot of large enterprise clients across the world. And what I've learned over the last, call it 30 years in these kind of interactions and engagements and leading workshops with these kind of clients is fundamentally, the challenge is rarely a technology challenge. Usually it boils down to what I'd call more of a strategy challenge or a leadership challenge, and those are often very tightly connected. And the underlying technology is just the driver. But what made me write the book and really engage with the River Group is the technologies behind AI, and now in particular agentic AI, are moving at a speed that organizations and enterprises have never experienced before, dwarfing the speed of the cloud revolution or the SaaS revolution. And so leaders and executives need to think about how they're moving and how they're thinking about this in a very different way.
Yeah, I think it's really amazing to see both how fast the technology is moving, but also how fast our organizations are moving to adopt it. And there's a lot of things written about how we're failing or it's moving slowly or what have you. But in fact, we've made an amazing amount of progress in leveraging this technology. There's just more possibilities that are unfolding as the technology unfolds. And our organizations aren't designed to change that quickly. In fact, Part of the job of executive leadership is to create consistency and stability and predictability. And so when we start to throw in lots of changes in very narrow windows of time, it really is antithetical to the kind of leadership responsibilities and approaches that we've used in the past. So I'm really glad that you have taken this issue on, and I'm so excited about our September 15th workshop. So let's talk a little bit about that workshop, why we're putting it together, and what you will be accomplishing with the executives in the room.
Absolutely. Fundamentally, the frameworks and processes described in the book are all on the book's website, and we'll talk about that later. But what I've seen is leaders at enterprises and organizations can use some help in being led through these and applying them to a real outcome that they own. And so what we're going to be doing here in a few weeks is bringing these leaders together, either individually or perhaps with another member of their team, and related to one particular business outcome that they own. And I say that very specifically, not an outcome related to agentic AI or technology, but a business outcome that they own. We're going to work with them to identify how do they watch on a continuous basis the evolution of these technologies and systems that are underlying that outcome, and how do they make sure that they are able to choose the best outcome and the best path there, given that constantly changing foundation. I call it the water underneath the boat that they're steering toward this particular outcome. So doing an appropriate watching of those changes and learning how to do that on a continuous basis and applying that to an actual outcome they really own in the business, I think is the fundamental premise of what we're going to be doing in that workshop.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful when we take things that we are learning conceptually and apply them right away. That all by itself, I think, is really valuable. But this collaborative element, I think, is as well. In your model, you talk about how the agentic technology is like the river, and it's moving very quickly. And our organizational scope of responsibility in our organization, if you're the CEO, the whole organization, but whatever you're running is like the boat. And what's happening is as we're moving down the river, the speed of the river is changing. The currents are changing. The obstacles are changing and so forth. And so unlike many other change management maybe that we have experienced and led in the past, this one has not a solid foundation under it. It has a river under it. It has this moving substrate underneath us. And that is part of the nature of what makes it different. I think we've all experienced that. We talk about the whiplash of the change in the technology and so forth. But I don't think we've really translated that as so crisply as you have in this analogy. Now, having said that, there are several other things that you pull out that I think are also very critical to what makes this transformation really different. And one of those is the fact that the context in which we are giving these agents agency is part of what makes it important for them to operate properly. But you highlight how that context is actually derived from the larger context of the responsibility of the executive. So would you talk about that?
Yeah, context is a really interesting topic these days because from the technology perspective, we've been talking about context engineering for some time, right? Which is how do you give the AI model or now the agent the proper data in which to operate on? But in the wider organizational context, if you're trying no pun intended, you're trying to navigate this boat on this constantly moving water underneath you to the appropriate outcome or to achieve your goal, you have to think of context as more than just how you connect your AI to a particular data set or a database. It's really about what do you own in the organization? What information do you have access to? What are the rules and responsibilities and even a lot of the softer organizational elements that your team exists within? And how can you provide your agentic AI system with that kind of context? And so that it can make the appropriate decisions for you, and just as a member of your team would, right? A human member of your team would. And so one analogy I describe in the book is the context you can provide to your AI agents is really equivalent to your scope of responsibility in your organization. And just as you use that overall context to lead human employees, you can and probably need to provide that kind of context to your agentic employees if you want them to be able to make decisions of a similar quality.
Yeah, I think that's a really important observation that you've made there. That is a key element for the leader to be revealing. And we don't normally reveal that, do we?
No, and it can be uncomfortable because as a leader, we often think about, okay, what am I ultimately responsible for? What do I control? What is my overall organizational context? And then we want to be very selective in terms of sharing that context. Well, in some cases, you think it as your scope of control with others. And in this rapidly changing space of agentic AI, to some degree, the more willing and able you are to share it, the more likely it is that you're going to achieve your outcomes in a controlled and governed way.
So that's both sharing information that you might have that you otherwise wouldn't need, if you will, to share, but also having some transparency about the logic behind what you think that information means. Now, that's a very different style of leadership than many people use, but it's not completely unfamiliar. So does it change primarily the approach that the executive's taking or the structure of the way they are actually leading?
Fundamentally, I think it goes back to the fact that this is not really a book on AI strategy. It's a book on corporate strategy. And what you said about transparency is exactly what effective leaders do and have done for eons in organizations. The more transparent and open you are with your team, with your organization, the less you have to micromanage what they do every day because they understand the overall context. That's transparent. They understand the fundamental goals of what you're trying to achieve. With the use of technology in these organizations, it used to be very deterministic. You just laid out precisely, you need to do A, B, and C using this data. But these new agentic systems and technologies need that kind of wider, transparent context that you, as an effective leader, were probably giving to your team already. Now you have to think about how you provide that same context to these underlying technical systems.
So when we're doing strategy work, how does it change the strategy work to be thinking in this way? I understand what you're saying about the need to be transparent about the context, because if we don't give, there's the exception handling and the rationale and the intention and these kinds of things that are related to what we don't really build into our processes. We expect people to bring to the party. So if we want to have something like an agent bring that to the party instead, then we have to make that clear. I get that whole element of it. I think there's been a fair amount of communication about that part, but you're really speaking to something that's above that. So tell me about how you bring that piece out in your work, because you do consulting work as well as you're an author and you do public speaking and you're doing this workshop. So you are in the mode of helping executives to connect the dots from what they've been doing to what they need to do in this new world. And I'm asking you really to help me understand that in this conversation so that our listeners can start to take action on this even before they get exposed beyond this conversation.
Let me make it a little bit more concrete and maybe step back a bit. So the fundamental strategic decision that these organizational leaders and executives need to make or are faced with making is the choice between retrofitting the work they're doing and reimagining their work they're doing in this age of agentic AI. Again, given this constantly moving water and the surges of agentic AI that are happening underneath their organization. So they're trying to achieve important strategic goals. They've got very concrete numbers and targets against these goals. And now they've got this new set of possibilities in front of them that are constantly changing. And on one end of the spectrum, they can retrofit. They can decide to basically take the goals they've already got, take the processes they're already using, and perhaps speed them up or make them more efficient using these technologies. And that's a very valid strategic choice to make. The challenge with that choice is it's probably just as easy for your competitors to do that kind of retrofit as it is for you. So while increasing efficiency and speed is sometimes very important to do, and there are lots of good examples of it these days, it's probably not creating lasting differentiation.
Yeah, when speakers come and talk about their use cases at our events and so forth, and these amazing things that they're doing with AI to transform their organizations, they most commonly fall in that category that you're talking about, where they have made something that they're already doing better. Sometimes they bring in things, though, that are really what we would refer to as redesigning.
Yes, and I go even maybe a little bit conceptually further than that and refer to it as reimagination. So retrofit on the other hand, on the one hand, and then reimagine on the sort of other end of the scale. And that's when you think, okay, let's not just take what I'm doing and make it more efficient or faster. Let's absolutely rethink how I'm doing that in the first place. And that engenders usually a rethink in terms of how you're using the workforce, either human or agentic or hybrid, redesigning the workflow, the way that work is done, and then thinking through the context and some of the governance issues. But if the closer you can get to reimagine in terms of how you want to achieve your goals and outcomes, the more differentiating it tends to be in the long run, because it's harder for competitors to just copy that change.
Do you think maybe one of the reasons that agentic projects are struggling to survive deployment in production is because the decision was to maybe be a little too aggressive in the reimagination end of it? Or do you think there's a different reason that these projects are struggling?
I think the main reason Gartner and all the rest have been talking about all these failed AI pilots and initiatives is because they're being primarily thought of as technology initiatives. They're being thought of as an agentic AI project or an AI project. And like I said before, I fundamentally reject that premise in the book. Again, this book is not a book about AI strategy. It's a book about corporate strategy in the age of agentic AI, right? And so don't start with a thought process of, okay, we've got this AI, we've got these agents, what can we do? Start with, what are my business outcomes? What do I need to achieve? And then how can I either retrofit to make them more efficient and effective, or potentially reimagine them using these systems, these technologies? It's not a technology challenge, it's a business challenge. And then make sure that you're partnering with the right people in the organization to help you figure out how to use the technology to achieve the outcome. I think, just as a quick aside, I think too many of these AI and agentic AI projects have been fundamentally driven from the board to the CIO or CTO. You are in charge of our AI strategy. Okay. And of course, those leaders are critically important to implementing any strategy that's fundamentally impacted by technology. But as soon as you think about it as our AI strategy or our agentic AI strategy, I think you've lost it from the get-go, which is why so many of these pilots and initial programs are not achieving an ROI.
Okay, so that I think is a good way to think about how to build a successful one. So if we say, oh, let's look a little bit at why things are failing, and let's look at how we can actually use this in an effective way. So going back to your spectrum of retrofit to reimagine, and picking up on your thread that the reimagine gives you a more competitive advantage, whereas the retrofit is something your competition could catch up to. Do you think the desire to approach your outcome in a different way in order to create competitive differentiation is the main reason to choose reimagine, or are there other reasons, drivers, that would take you down the reimagine path?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think you definitely, I want to make clear, first of all, that there is no wrong place on that spectrum. I'm not at all arguing that reimagine is the right end of the spectrum and retrofit is not, right? It really depends on, again, what outcomes do you own? What targets are you trying to achieve? And sometimes a near-term, quicker and easier retrofit is absolutely the right strategic move to make, while you watch the as I describe it, watching the water, watching the ecosystem that's going on around you, waiting for the technology to get to the point where you can drive a higher probability outcome on the reimagine. So there is no wrong answer to where it is on that spectrum. But I do think the challenge a lot of leaders have right now is they're just being flooded with information about AI. The volume of reports and newsletters and everything that comes out is full of so much noise. And it's a lot of quasi-technical information that actually doesn't have a strategic outcome for the organization. It's very hard for a leader to filter that out and really say, okay, but what really affects my strategic outcomes and what do I have to do based on that? And having a clearer view of what's going on around the organization in terms of the water, as I describe it, will, I think, increase the possibility in the long run that a reimagine outcome is embraced and ultimately is successful.
One of the reasons that I was so excited about the possibility of offering a workshop on this issue is from the beginning, this issue of organizational and management challenges has been on the table. And it's been the most persistent issue, actually, from the very earliest days. And we like to focus on the strategies to overcome those obstacles rather than describing them. And this felt like a strategy for overcoming the obstacle. Follow a model that is about making decisions that are going to lead to success and that are going to be business-based, rooting in the outcome of the business rather than rooting in the adoption of the technology. So we're really excited to see how this helps the executives who participate in this workshop. It's also practical. That's another element that we think is really important, is giving people a way to operationalize what they're doing. And one of the things I like that you've done is you have coupled the work of the leader with whoever they need to collaborate with or whoever they need to convince to be a part of it, and are offering that they bring a colleague. And you're doing that under the same ticket, which is a really wonderful way of signaling to the executive, we really want you to bring these people into the room. And then by having a mixed room of executives, you're also learning from other industries. And that's an element that people like about our community, is that we give them that cross-industry fertilization, because they feel like, I know a lot about what's going on in my industry. I need to know what's going on in other industries. So I think that's a really well-constructed room. But put some color for us on what you will do with that room. So we've got the ability to collaborate with people from other industries, and we have the ability to work with a peer if we bring one.
Let me just touch first on the idea you bring up of the value of having more than one person from an organization in the room, because that loops exactly back to the context discussion we started with, right? The closer you get to the reimagine end of the spectrum, it's likely that you will need a wider context in order to achieve the outcome that you're shooting toward, obviously. And so that's why getting a larger number of stakeholders together across your team or across multiple teams, sometimes even including folks outside the organization, can be really important to having the wide enough context in order to effectively drive that reimagine. So that's why it definitely makes sense to at least begin by bringing a partner with you into the room, into a workshop like we're hosting, so you can begin that process of enabling solutions with that wider outcome.
Yeah, clearly, if we want to do, say, redesign the outcome of our funnel, we want to have a higher performing funnel. We can't do that with not having both sales and marketing and even success and support in the conversation, because they're going to be impacted by it as well.
Yeah.
So that makes a lot of sense that you would want to have more than one player in there. We might need the support of other groups too that have a little wider reach, like maybe product.
Absolutely.
Okay, that makes really good sense. Now let's talk about how we would experience that in the room.
Yeah. So let me go back to that. And very closely related to that, I want to make sure people understand something clear. This is not about making one decision and then moving on to execute against that decision. The fundamental thing we're working through in the workshop and in the framework is about the ability for you and your organization to be continuously watching, as I describe it in the book, what's going on around you, the context, in particular, the context of the capabilities of agentic AI within an understanding of what your goals are. And so what we're going to do in the workshop is really take one or a few particular outcomes that you're trying to achieve with your business, and then teach you the methodology for watching for the important moves in the underlying technology, this river of agentic AI that will allow you to set your position on the retrofit to reimagine spectrum. And again, that's setting at this one point in time because the water's continuously moving, and learning how to navigate that continuously moving water is exactly what we're doing. And fundamentally, there's 3 questions that we'll be talking through and working through with workshop attendees that are relative to a particular specific outcome that you have. The first is, as capability of AI and agentic AI crossed from demoware to actually deployable against your work and your outcome, how do you know that is happening? The second question is, has someone reset, and maybe that someone is you, reset what good looks like for an outcome? Maybe a goal has got harder to achieve or has been not very often, but sometimes easier to achieve. And how does that reset how you think about applying these technologies and solutions? And then finally, has anything you assumed either about the technology, your organization, or any of those assumptions no longer true? Okay. And again, these are not one-time decisions, but these are things that you should be continuously reevaluating against your outcome because, again, the technology and underlying river is changing so fast. And we're going to show you how to do that, but not just in the abstract. We're going to actually do that against one of your particular outcomes in the workshop.
That's great. So we're going to leave with a new skill set, really.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's fantastic. One of the things that strikes me about this time that is also different, besides the rapidly changing technology underneath us, is the level of uncertainty around us. I've never seen a more uncertain time. We have changes at the economic level, at the political level, at the social level, etc. At every level, we have very high uncertainty. So the uncertainty of the technology in many ways is unidirectional. This is make sure river really a great analogy here, right? It doesn't usually flow backwards. It only flows in one direction. The uncertainty around us is changing in more of a 360-degree way, the way weather changes, right? So it strikes me that this approach that you are teaching or imparting on people, this method of thinking about our outcomes, is well served if you just were to isolate it in these uncertain times. So yes, it's driven by the adoption of a particular type of, or the possibility of adoption of a particular type of technology, but it seems really well suited to the way in which our businesses are, or the context, if you will, in which our businesses are operating.
I couldn't agree more. And I'll repeat what I said earlier, which is fundamentally, you could remove every reference to AI and agentic AI out of the book. And what you'd have is a methodology for dealing with extremely rapid change in your organization at a speed that we've, as you said, have never really had to deal with before. But the reason it fundamentally does relate to AI and agentic AI is that is a technology driver, which is driving the kind of organizational and even societal change at a speed that we have never seen before. And we are only at the beginning of it. We're not even at first base on what's happening right now. So over the next, I'd say 5 years, we're going to have to buckle up and be ready for massive change, and ensuring your team and your organization has the skills to navigate that appropriately is fundamentally what the book is about, what our workshop will be about.
I think it's really exciting to have a approach that is so well thought out and so accessible to people. As you're working with enterprises, executive teams in your consulting work, tell us a little bit about what you're seeing in the before and after. If we were to talk with them about the outcomes that they're experiencing as a result of having worked with you, what would they tell us?
It's so interesting, and I've been doing this, as we said at the beginning, for decades. I'm always working with senior executives, very smart people. They didn't get to the level they are unless they are good leaders, great operators. That's just a given. And yet I'm continuously surprised at the value of having an outside force, either a moderator or somebody who can help them put the pieces together and see things that they just can't see. Again, because they've got a shared, back to context, they've got a shared context for what they're trying to do, what they're trying to achieve. And having a framework and sometimes even a person that helps break through that context is always valuable. I've never seen it not be valuable to the point where the team goes, wow, that was incredible. And so I'm certainly trying to do that with the framework in the book itself, break the context, and the study guide and the workshop guide is actually on the book's website now. So a team can take this and begin to start working through it. But this is why I do think the workshop will be really effective, because we can help guide them through that process as well. And I've only ever seen it be very powerful.
Now, what about the specifics of the model itself? What are people telling you about how the model has helped change their trajectory or the outcomes their organizations are experiencing?
It's really about, I think one of the critical changes is around operationalizing what I call the watching, right? And most leadership teams are working through some kind of long-term strategic planning process, right? Which may have maybe perhaps annualized outcomes in terms of changing the direction and strategy and goals of the organization. But like we just discussed, the pace of change is now moving to the place where some kind of annualized reassessment of strategy is just not enough if you want to stay ahead and if you want to stay competitive. And so rethinking how that works and operationalizing the ability to understand and respond to the change that's happening in closer to real time is, I think, a new muscle that a lot of these organizations need to build. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that these enterprises need to become startups and be constantly pivoting. That would be a failure mode for sure. But they need to operationalize at least what I call the watching, the understanding of what's going on around you, especially again with the push and the surges in AI and agentic AI, and then be able to make decisions. Okay, does this mean we have to do something now or not? And if yes, what is it? Is it a small retrofit of our operations, or is it opening up the possibility of a reimagine? Companies that are only trained to even think about doing that on an annual basis are, I think, going to have some big challenges over the next decade.
Well, that's really, I think, a valuable insight and a good outcome for people to have a new way that they're able to respond to these rapidly changing situations. So what resources would you recommend for listeners who want to learn more?
Obviously, the book itself is a resource, and I've mentioned a couple times the website riverdoesn'twait.com, where the discussion guide is posted and free. There's also available on the website a free monthly briefing where I read what's going on in the AI and agentic AI landscape. And I have the unenviable task of sorting through all the noise so I can get just down to the content that a busy executive can actually potentially think it could be strategic to their organization. Now, of course, in the workshop itself, we're going to show you how to begin to do that yourself. So you can actually, with a deep understanding of your context, be able to do that noise filter for yourself and actually make strategic outcomes. So the book, the website, and then, of course, the workshop we're doing together would be a great way of learning more and being able to use this in the real world.
And you also could come into the organization and work with people too if you do consulting work. And we should have said early on that the book is called The River Doesn't Wait, a senior executive guide to navigating the surge of agentic AI. And we'll make sure that there's a link to the book and to the website and to all of Blaine's work in the resources section and any other suggestions he has. There's a wonderful area of his website, riverdoesn'twait.com, that has all the references that he cites in the book. And he keeps that up to date so you can go back to either access the resources again or find updates as he makes them. And I think that's a really lovely addition that you've made to what most authors obviously don't do that, but I think it's a good addition that you've added. So let me ask you a different question, similar to what you've been talking about, but in a little different way. We're going to personalize it. So in the AI revolution, what leadership skill do you find most valuable in your work today?
In my work, and I think this applies to leaders generally, and this is, I think, a fundamental insight that I've gained over the last decade or two, is most senior leaders and executives are really good deciders, all right? But they're not practiced at revisiting a decision before the numbers make them, right? Once they're not no longer on track to achieve the goal, then they can start making decisions, right, and taking actions. But with the speed of the underlying change that's happening right now, driven by AI and agentic AI, I think waiting until the numbers tell you something is probably too late because things are moving too quick. The new leadership skill, I think, is about being really good at revisiting decisions by watching and understanding the ever-evolving context before the numbers force you to do that. That's a bit uncomfortable, especially in organizations that have very well-structured long-term planning processes. But that's a skill that has to be built in the near term here.
Great. So if our listeners remember just one thing from our conversation today, what should it be and why?
Let's say there's no such thing as an AI strategy. There's a business outcome that you own, and the medium under it, we call it the river of agentic AI, has just moved. Even during the time we've had this conversation, it's been moving. So start with the outcome, not the technology, and then understand how to assess this continuously moving context so you can make the best decisions.
Blaine Mathieu, founder of the River Group and author of The River Doesn't Wait. Thank you so much for sharing your experience with us today.
Thank you, Christine. It was a lot of fun.
Why the future is bright.
Thank you for listening to this episode of AI Realized podcast. We hope you enjoyed hearing about what's new now and next for enterprise AI. Let us know what topics would help you on your journey to use AI to redesign your organization from the inside out. Remember to share this episode with a friend, subscribe and leave a review, and listen to more episodes of AI Realized.